Condition of the Working Class in England, by Engels, 1845. The great towns. A town, such as London, where a man may wander for hours together without reaching the beginning of the end, without meeting the slightest hint which could lead to the inference that there is open country within reach, is a strange thing. This colossal centralization, this heaping together of 2.5 millions of human beings at one point, has multiplied the power of this 2.5 millions 100-fold. Has raised London to the commercial capital of the world, created the giant docks and assembled the 1,000 vessels that continually cover the Thames. I know nothing more imposing than the view which the Thames offers during the ascent from the sea to London Bridge. The masses of buildings, the wharves on both sides, especially from Woolwich upwards, the countless ships along both shores, crowding ever closer and closer together, until, at last, only a narrow passage remains in the middle of the river, a passage through which hundreds of steamers shoot by one another. All this is so vast, so impressive, that a man cannot collect himself, but is lost in the marvel of England's greatness before he sets foot upon English soil. 3. But the sacrifices which all this has cost become apparent later. After roaming the streets of the capital a day or two, making headway with difficulty through the human turmoil and the endless lines of vehicles, after visiting the slums of the metropolis, one realizes for the first time that these Londoners have been forced to sacrifice the best qualities of their human nature, to bring to pass all the marvels of civilization which crowd their city. That 100 powers which slumbered within them have remained inactive, have been suppressed in order that a few might be developed more fully and multiply through union with those of others. The very turmoil of the streets has something repulsive, something against which human nature rebels. The hundreds of thousands of all classes and ranks crowding past each other, are they not all human beings with the same qualities and powers, and with the same interest in being happy? And have they not, in the end, to seek happiness in the same way, by the same means? And still they crowd by one another as though they had nothing in common, nothing to do with one another, and their only agreement is the tacit one, that each keep to his own side of the pavement, so as not to delay the opposing streams of the crowd, while it occurs to no man to honor another with so much as a glance. The brutal indifference, the unfeeling isolation of each in his private interest, becomes the more repellent and offensive, the more these individuals are crowded together, within a limited space. And, however much one may be aware that this isolation of the individual, this narrow self-seeking, is the fundamental principle of our society everywhere, it is nowhere so shamelessly barefaced, so self-conscious as just here in the crowding of the great city. The dissolution of mankind into monads, of which each one has a separate principle, the world of atoms, is here carried out to its utmost extreme. Hence it comes, too, that the social war, the war of each against all, is here openly declared. Just as in Stirner's recent book The Ego and its own people regard each other only as useful objects, each exploits the other, and the end of it all is that the stronger treads the weaker underfoot, and that the powerful few, the capitalists, seize everything for themselves, while to the weak many, the poor, scarcely a bare existence remains. What is true of London, is true of Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, is true of all great towns. Everywhere barbarous indifference, hard egotism on one hand, and nameless misery on the other, everywhere social warfare, every man's house in a state of siege, everywhere reciprocal plundering under the protection of the law, and all so shameless, so openly avowed that one shrinks before the consequences of our social state as they manifest themselves here undisguised, and can only wonder that the whole crazy fabric still hangs together. Since capital, the direct or indirect control of the means of subsistence and production, is the weapon with which this social warfare is carried on, it is clear that all the disadvantages of such a state must fall upon the poor. For him no man has the slightest concern. Cast into the whirlpool, he must struggle through as well as he can. If he is so happy as to find work, i.e., if the bourgeoisie does him the favor to enrich itself by means of him, wages await him which scarcely suffice to keep body and soul together. If he can get no work he may steal, if he is not afraid of the police, or starve, in which case the police will take care that he does so in a quiet and inoffensive manner. During my residence in England, at least 20 or 30 persons have died of simple starvation under the most revolting circumstances, and a jury has rarely been found possessed of the courage to speak the plain truth in the matter. Let the testimony of the witnesses be never so clear and unequivocal, the bourgeoisie, from which the jury is selected, always finds some backdoor through which to escape the frightful verdict, death from starvation. The bourgeoisie dare not speak the truth in these cases, for it would speak its own condemnation. But indirectly, far more than directly, many have died of starvation, where long-continued want of proper nourishment has called forth fatal illness, when it has produced such debility that causes which might otherwise have remained inoperative brought on severe illness and death. The English working men call this social murder, and accuse our whole society of perpetrating this crime perpetually. Are they wrong? True, it is only individuals who starve, but what security has the working man that it may not be his turn tomorrow? Who assures him employment, who vouches for it that, if for any reason or no reason his lord and master discharges him tomorrow, he can struggle along with those dependent upon him, until he may find someone else to give him bread? Who guarantees that willingness to work shall suffice to obtain work, that uprightness, industry, thrift, and the rest of the virtues recommended by the bourgeoisie, are really his road to happiness? No one. He knows that he has something today and that it does not depend upon himself whether he shall have something tomorrow. He knows that every breeze that blows, every whim of his employer, every bad turn of trade may hurl him back into the fierce whirlpool from which he has temporarily saved himself, and in which it is hard and often impossible to keep his head above water. He knows that, though he may have the means of living today, it is very uncertain whether he shall tomorrow. Meanwhile, let us proceed to a more detailed investigation of the position in which the social war has placed the non-possessing class. Let us see what pay for his work society does give the working man in the form of dwelling, clothing, food, what sort of subsistence it grants those who contribute most to the maintenance of society, and, first, let us consider the dwellings. Every great city has one or more slums, where the working class is crowded together. True, poverty often dwells in hidden alleys close to the palaces of the rich. But, in general, a separate territory has been assigned to it, where, removed from the sight of the happier classes, it may struggle along as it can. These slums are pretty equally arranged in all the great towns of England, the worst houses in the worst quarters of the towns. Usually one or two-storied cottages in long rows, perhaps with cellars used as dwellings, almost always irregularly built. These houses of 3 or 4 rooms and a kitchens form, throughout England, some parts of London excepted, the general dwellings of the working class. The streets are generally unpaved, rough, dirty, filled with vegetable and animal refuse, without sewers or gutters, but supplied with foul, stagnant pools instead. Moreover, ventilation is impeded by the bad, confused method of building of the whole quarter, and since many human beings here live crowded into a small space, the atmosphere that prevails in these working men's quarters may readily be imagined. Further, the streets serve as drying grounds in fine weather. Lines are stretched across from house to house, and hung with wet clothing. Let us investigate some of the slums in their order. London comes first, and in London the famous Rookery of St. Giles, which is now, at last, about to be penetrated by a couple of broad streets. St. Giles is in the midst of the most populous part of the town, surrounded by broad, splendid avenues in which the gay world of London idles about, in the immediate neighbourhood of Oxford Street, Regent Street, of Trafalgar Square and the Strand. It is a disorderly collection of tall, 3 or 4-storied houses, with narrow, crooked, filthy streets, in which there is quite as much life as in the great thoroughfares of the town, except that, here, people of the working class only are to be seen. A vegetable market is held in the street, baskets with vegetables and fruits, naturally all bad and hardly fit to use, obstruct the sidewalk still further, and from these, as well as from the fish dealers' stalls, arises a horrible smell. The houses are occupied from cellar to garret, filthy within and without, and their appearance is such that no human being could possibly wish to live in them. But all this is nothing in comparison with the dwellings in the narrow courts and alleys between the streets, entered by covered passages between the houses, in which the filth and tottering ruins surpass all description. Scarcely a whole window pane can be found, the walls are crumbling, doorposts and window frames loose and broken, doors of old boards nailed together, or altogether wanting in this thieves' quarter, where no doors are needed, there being nothing to steal. Heaps of garbage and ashes lie in all directions, and the foul liquids emptied before the doors gather in stinking pools. Here live the poorest of the poor, the worst paid workers with thieves and the victims of prostitution indiscriminately huddled together, the majority Irish, or of Irish extraction, and those who have not yet sunk in the whirlpool of moral ruin which surrounds them, sinking daily deeper, losing daily more and more of their power to resist the demoralizing influence of want, filth, and evil surroundings. Nor is St. Giles the only London slum. In the immense tangle of streets, there are hundreds and thousands of alleys and courts lined with houses too bad for anyone to live in, who can still spend anything whatsoever upon a dwelling fit for human beings. Close to the splendid houses of the rich such a lurking place of the bitterest poverty may often be found. So, a short time ago, on the occasion of a coroner's inquest, a region close to Portman Square, one of the very respectable squares, was characterized as an abode of a multitude of Irish demoralized by poverty and filth. So, too, may be found in streets, such as Long Acre and others, which, though not fashionable, are yet respectable, a great number of cellar dwellings out of which puny children and half-starved, ragged women emerge into the light of day. In the immediate neighbourhood of Drury Lane Theatre, the second in London, are some of the worst streets of the whole metropolis, Charles, King, and Park Streets, in which the houses are inhabited from cellar to garret exclusively by poor families. In the parishes of St. John and St. Margaret there lived in 1840, according to the Journal of the Statistical Society, 5,566 working men's families in 5,294 dwellings, if they deserve the name. Men, women, and children thrown together without distinction of age or sex, 26,850 persons all told. And of these families 3/4 possessed but one room. In the aristocratic parish of St. George, Hanover Square, there lived, according to the same authority, 1,465 working men's families, nearly 6,000 persons, under similar conditions, and here, too, more than 2/3 of the whole number crowded together at the rate of one family in one room. And how the poverty of these unfortunates, among whom even thieves find nothing to steal, is exploited by the property-holding class in lawful ways. The abominable dwellings in Drury Lane, just mentioned, bring in the following rents: 2 cellar dwellings, 3s, 1 room, ground floor, 4s, 2nd story, 4s, 6d, 3rd floor, 4s, garret room, 3s, weekly, so that the starving occupants of Charles Street alone pay the house owners a yearly tribute of £2,000, and the 5,566 families above mentioned in Westminster, a yearly rent of £40,000. The most extensive working people's district lies east of the Tower in Whitechapel and Bethnal Green, where the greatest masses of London working people live. Let us hear Mr. G. Alston, preacher of St. Philip's, Bethnal Green, on the condition of his parish. He says, it contains 1,400 houses, inhabited by 2,795 families, comprising a population of 12,000. The space within which this large amount of population are living is less than 400 yards square, 1,200 feet, and it is no uncommon thing for a man and his wife, with 4 or 5 children, and sometimes the grandfather and grandmother, to be found living in a room from 10 to 12 feet square, and which serves them for eating and working in. I believe that till the Bishop of London called the attention of the public to the state of Bethnal Green, about as little was known at the west end of the town of this most destitute parish as the wilds of Australia or the islands of the South Seas. If we really desire to find out the most destitute and deserving, we must lift the latch of their doors, and find them at their scanty meal. We must see them when suffering from sickness and want of work. And if we do this from day to day in such a neighbourhood as Bethnal Green, we shall become acquainted with a mass of wretchedness and misery such as a nation like our own ought to be ashamed to permit. I was curate of a parish near Huddersfield during the 3 years of the greatest manufacturing distress. But I never witnessed such a thorough prostration of the poor as I have seen since I have been in Bethnal Green. There is not one father of a family in 10 throughout the entire district that possesses any clothes but his working dress, and that too commonly in the worst tattered condition, and with many this wretched clothing forms their only covering at night, with nothing better than a bag of straw or shavings to lie upon. The foregoing description furnishes an idea of the aspect of the interior of the dwellings. But let us follow the English officials, who occasionally stray thither, into one or two of these workingmen's homes. On the occasion of an inquest held November 16, 1843, by Mr. Carter, coroner for Surrey, upon the body of Anne Galway, aged 45 years, the newspapers related the following particulars concerning the deceased. She had lived at number 5 White Lion Court, Bermondsey Street, London, with her husband and a 19-year-old son in a little room, in which neither a bedstead nor any other furniture was to be seen. She lay dead beside her son upon a heap of feathers which were scattered over her almost naked body, there being neither sheet nor coverlet. The feathers stuck so fast over the whole body that the physician could not examine the corpse until it was cleansed, and then found it starved and scarred from the bites of vermin. Part of the floor of the room was torn up, and the whole used by the family as a privy. On Monday, January 15, 1844, 2 boys were brought before the police magistrate because, being in a starving condition, they had stolen and immediately devoured a half-cooked calf's foot from a shop. The magistrate felt called upon to investigate the case further, and received the following details from the policeman. The mother of the 2 boys was the widow of an ex-soldier, afterwards policeman, and had had a very hard time since the death of her husband, to provide for her 9 children. She lived at number 2 Pools Place, Quaker Court, Spitalfields, in the utmost poverty. When the policeman came to her, he found her with 6 of her children literally huddled together in a little back room, with no furniture but 2 old rush-bottomed chairs with the seats gone, a small table with 2 legs broken, a broken cup, and a small dish. On the hearth was scarcely a spark of fire, and in one corner lay as many old rags as would fill a woman's apron, which served the whole family as a bed. For bed clothing they had only their scanty day clothing. The poor woman told him that she had been forced to sell her bedstead the year before to buy food. Her bedding she had pawned with the victualler for food. In short, everything had gone for food. The magistrate ordered the woman a considerable provision from the poor box. In February, 1844, Teresa Bishop, a widow 60 years old, was recommended, with her sick daughter, aged 26, to the compassion of the police magistrate in Marlborough Street. She lived at number 5 Brown Street, Grosvenor Square, in a small back room no larger than a closet, in which there was not one single piece of furniture. In one corner lay some rags upon which both slept, a chest served as table and chair. The mother earned a little by charing. The owner of the house said that they had lived in this way since May 1843, had gradually sold or pawned everything that they had, and had still never paid any rent. The magistrate assigned them £1 from the poor box. I am far from asserting that all London working people live in such want as the foregoing 3 families. I know very well that 10 are somewhat better off, where one is so totally trodden under foot by society, but I assert that thousands of industrious and worthy people, far worthier and more to be respected than the rich of London, do find themselves in a condition unworthy of human beings, and that every proletarian, everyone, without exception, is exposed to a similar fate without any fault of his own and in spite of every possible effort. But in spite of all this, they who have some kind of a shelter are fortunate, fortunate in comparison with the utterly homeless. In London 50,000 human beings get up every morning, not knowing where they are to lay their heads at night. The luckiest of this multitude, those who succeed in keeping a penny or 2 until evening, enter a lodging house, such as abound in every great city, where they find a bed. But what a bed! These houses are filled with beds from cellar to garret, 4, 5, 6 beds in a room. As many as can be crowded in. Into every bed 4, 5, or 6 human beings are piled, as many as can be packed in, sick and well, young and old, drunk and sober, men and women, just as they come, indiscriminately. Then come strife, blows, wounds, or, if these bedfellows agree, so much the worse. Thefts are arranged and things done which our language, grown more humane than our deeds, refuses to record. And those who cannot pay for such a refuge, they sleep where they find a place, in passages, arcades, in corners where the police and the owners leave them undisturbed. A few individuals find their way to the refuges which are managed, here and there, by private charity. Others sleep on the benches in the parks close under the windows of Queen Victoria. Let us hear the London Times. It appears from the report of the proceedings at Marlborough Street Police Court in our columns of yesterday, that there is an average number of 50 human beings of all ages, who huddle together in the parks every night, having no other shelter than what is supplied by the trees and a few hollows of the embankment. Of these, the majority are young girls who have been seduced from the country by the soldiers and turned loose on the world in all the destitution of friendless penury, and all the recklessness of early vice. This is truly horrible. Poor there must be everywhere. Indigence will find its way and set up its hideous state in the heart of a great and luxurious city. Amid the thousand narrow lanes and by streets of a populous metropolis there must always, we fear, be much suffering, much that offends the eye, much that lurks unseen. But that within the precincts of wealth, gaiety, and fashion, neither regal grandeur of St. James, close on the palatial splendor of Bayswater, on the confines of the old and new aristocratic quarters, in a district where the cautious refinement of modern design has refrained from creating one single tenement for poverty, which seems, as it were, dedicated to the exclusive enjoyment of wealth, that their want, and famine, and disease, and vice should stalk in all their kindred horrors, consuming body by body, soul by soul. It is indeed a monstrous state of things. Enjoyment the most absolute, that bodily ease, intellectual excitement, or the more innocent pleasures of sense can supply to man's craving, brought in close contact with the most unmitigated misery. Wealth, from its bright saloons, laughing, an insolently heedless laugh, at the unknown wounds of want. Pleasure, cruelly but unconsciously mocking the pain that moans below. All contrary things mocking one another, all contrary, save the vice which tempts and the vice which is tempted. But let all men remember this, that within the most courtly precincts of the richest city of God's earth, there may be found, night after night, winter after winter, women, young in years, old in sin and suffering, outcasts from society, rotting from famine, filth, and disease. Let them remember this, and learn not to theorize but to act. God knows, there is much room for action nowadays. 5. I have referred to the refuges for the homeless. How greatly overcrowded these are, 2 examples may show. A newly erected refuge for the houseless in Upper Ogle Street, that can shelter 300 persons every night, has received since its opening, January 27 to March 17, 1844, 2,740 persons for 1 or more nights. And, although the season was growing more favorable, the number of applicants in this, as well as in the asylums of Whitecross Street and Wapping, was strongly on the increase, and a crowd of the homeless had to be sent away every night for want of room. In another refuge, the Central Asylum in Playhouse Yard, there were supplied on an average 460 beds nightly. During the first 3 months of the year 1844, 6,681 persons being sheltered, and 96,141 portions of bread were distributed. Yet the committee of directors declare this institution began to meet the pressure of the needy to a limited extent only when the Eastern Asylum also was opened. Let us leave London and examine the other great cities of the 3 kingdoms in their order. Let us take Dublin first, a city the approach to which from the sea is as charming as that of London is imposing. The Bay of Dublin is the most beautiful of the whole British island kingdom, and is even compared by the Irish with the Bay of Naples. The city, too, possesses great attractions, and its aristocratic districts are better and more tastefully laid out than those of any other British city. By way of compensation, however, the poorer districts of Dublin are among the most hideous and repulsive to be seen in the world. True, the Irish character, which under some circumstances, is comfortable only in the dirt, has some share in this. But as we find thousands of Irish in every great city in England and Scotland, and as every poor population must gradually sink into the same uncleanliness, the wretchedness of Dublin is nothing specific, nothing peculiar to Dublin, but something common to all great towns. The poor quarters of Dublin are extremely extensive, and the filth, the uninhabitableness of the houses and the neglect of the streets surpass all description. Some idea of the manner in which the poor are here crowded together may be formed from the fact that, in 1817, according to the report of the Inspector of Workhouses, 1,318 persons lived in 52 houses with 390 rooms in Barrack Street, and 1,997 persons in 71 houses with 393 rooms in and near Church Street, that foul lanes, courts, and yards are interposed between this and the adjoining streets. There are many cellars which have no light but from the door. In some of these cellars the inhabitants sleep on the floors, which are all earthen, but in general, they have bedsteads. Nicholson's Court contains 151 persons in 28 small apartments. Their state is very miserable, there being only 2 bedsteads and 2 blankets in the whole court. The poverty is so great in Dublin, that a single benevolent institution, the Mendicity Association, gives relief to 2,500 persons or 1% of the population daily, receiving and feeding them for the day and dismissing them at night. Dr. Allison describes a similar state of things in Edinburgh, whose superb situation, which has won it the title of the modern Athens, and whose brilliant aristocratic quarter in the new town, contrasts strongly with the foul wretchedness of the poor in the old town. Allison asserts that this extensive quarter is as filthy and horrible as the worst districts of Dublin, while the Mendicity Association would have as great a proportion of needy persons to assist in Edinburgh as in the Irish capital. He asserts, indeed, that the poor in Scotland, especially in Edinburgh and Glasgow, are worse off than in any other region of the 3 kingdoms, and that the poorest are not Irish, but Scotch. The preacher of the Old Church of Edinburgh, Dr. Lee, testified in 1836, before the Commission of Religious Instruction, that I have never seen such a concentration of misery as in this parish, where the people are without furniture, without everything. I frequently see the same room occupied by 2 married couples. I have been in one day in 7 houses where there was no bed, in some of them not even straw. I found people of 80 years of age lying on the boards. Many sleep in the same clothes which they wear during the day. I may mention the case of 2 Scotch families living in a cellar, who had come from the country within a few months. Since they came they had had 2 children dead, and another apparently dying. There was a little bundle of dirty straw in one corner, for one family, and in another for the other. In the place they inhabit it is impossible at noonday to distinguish the features of the human face without artificial light. It would almost make a heart of adamant bleed to see such an accumulation of misery in a country like this. In the Edinburgh Medical and Surgical Journal, Dr. Hennon reports a similar state of things. From a parliamentary report, 7 It is evident that in the dwellings of the poor of Edinburgh a want of cleanliness reigns, such as must be expected under these conditions. On the bedposts chickens roost at night, dogs and horses share the dwellings of human beings, and the natural consequence is a shocking stench, with filth and swarms of vermin. The prevailing construction of Edinburgh favours these atrocious conditions as far as possible. The old town is built upon both slopes of a hill, along the crest of which runs the High Street. Out of the High Street there open downwards multitudes of narrow, crooked alleys, called wynds from their many turnings, and these wynds form the proletarian district of the city. The houses of the Scotch cities, in general, are 5 or 6-storied buildings, like those of Paris, and in contrast with England where, so far as possible, each family has a separate house. The crowding of human beings upon a limited area is thus intensified. The House, says an English journal in an article upon the sanitary condition of the working people in cities, are often so close together, that persons may step from the window of one house to that of the house opposite, so high, piled story after story, that the light can scarcely penetrate to the court beneath. In this part of the town there are neither sewers nor any private conveniences whatever belonging to the dwellings. And hence the excrementitious and other refuse of at least 50,000 persons is, during the night, thrown into the gutters, causing, in spite of the scavengers' daily labors, an amount of solid filth and fetid exhalation disgusting to both sight and smell, as well as exceedingly prejudicial to health. Can it be wondered that, in such localities, health, morals, and common decency should be at once neglected. No, all who know the private condition of the inhabitants will bear testimony to the immense amount of their disease, misery, and demoralization. Society in these quarters has sunk to a state indescribably vile and wretched. The dwellings of the poorer classes are generally very filthy, apparently never subjected to any cleaning process whatever, consisting, in most cases, of a single room, ill-ventilated and yet cold, owing to broken, ill-fitting windows, sometimes damp and partially underground, and always scantily furnished and altogether comfortless, heaps of straw often serving for beds, in which a whole family, male and female, young and old, are huddled together in revolting confusion. The supplies of water are obtained only from the public pumps, and the trouble of procuring it of course favors the accumulation of all kinds of abominations. In the other great seaport towns the prospect is no better. Liverpool, with all its commerce, wealth, and grandeur yet treats its workers with the same barbarity. A full fifth of the population, more than 45,000 human beings, live in narrow, dark, damp, badly ventilated cellar dwellings, of which there are 7,862 in the city. Besides these cellar dwellings there are 2,270 courts, small spaces built up on all four sides and having but one entrance, a narrow, covered passageway, the whole ordinarily very dirty and inhabited exclusively by proletarians. Of such courts we shall have more to say when we come to Manchester. In Bristol, on one occasion, 2,800 families were visited, of whom 46% occupied but one room each. Precisely the same state of things prevails in the factory towns. In Nottingham there are in all 11,000 houses, of which between 7,000 and 8,000 are built back to back with a rear party wall so that no through ventilation is possible, while a single privy usually serves for several houses. During an investigation made a short time since, many rows of houses were found to have been built over shallow drains covered only by the boards of the ground floor. In Leicester, Derby, and Sheffield, it is no better. Of Birmingham, the article above cited from the Artisan states. In the older parts of the town there are many inferior streets and courts, which are dirty and neglected, filled with stagnant water and heaps of refuse. The courts of Birmingham are very numerous in every direction, exceeding 2,000, and comprising the residence of a large portion of the working classes. They are for the most part narrow, filthy, ill-ventilated, and badly drained, containing from 8 to 20 houses each, the houses being built against some other tenement and the end of the courts being pretty constantly occupied by ashpits, etc. The filth of which would defy description. It is but just, however, to remark that the courts of more modern date are built in a more rational manner, and kept tolerably respectable. And the cottages, even in old courts, are far less crowded than in Manchester and Liverpool, the result of which is, that the inhabitants, in epidemic seasons, have been much less visited by death than those of Wolverhampton, Dudley, and Bilston, at only a few miles' distance. Cellar residences, also, are unknown in Birmingham, though some few are, very improperly, used as workshops. The low lodging houses are pretty numerous, somewhat exceeding 400, chiefly in courts near the centre of the town. They are almost always loathsomely filthy and close, the resorts of beggars, trampers, thieves and prostitutes, who here, regardless alike of decency or comfort, eat, drink, smoke and sleep in an atmosphere unendurable by all except the degraded, besotted inmates. Glasgow is in many respects similar to Edinburgh, possessing the same wines, the same tall houses. Of this city the Artisan observes, the working class forms here some 78% of the whole population, about 300,000, and lives in parts of the city, which, in abject wretchedness, exceed the lowest purlieus of St. Giles or Whitechapel, the liberties of Dublin, or the wines of Edinburgh. Such localities exist most abundantly in the heart of the city, south of the Iron Gate and west of the Salt Market, as well as in the Calton, off the High Street, etc. Endless labyrinths of narrow lanes or wynds, into which almost at every step debouche courts or closes formed by old, ill-ventilated, towering houses crumbling to decay, destitute of water and crowded with inhabitants, comprising 3 or 4 families, perhaps 20 persons, on each flat, and sometimes each flat let out in lodgings that confine, we dare not say accommodate, from 15 to 20 persons in a single room. These districts are occupied by the poorest, most depraved, and most worthless portion of the population, and they may be considered as the fruitful source of those pestilential fevers which then spread their destructive ravages over the whole of Glasgow. Let us hear how J.C. Simons, Government Commissioner for the Investigation of the Condition of the Handweavers, describes these portions of the city. 8. I have seen human degradation in some of its worst phases, both in England and abroad, but I did not believe until I visited the wynds of Glasgow, that so large an amount of filth, crime, misery, and disease existed in any civilized country. In the lower lodging houses 10, 12, and sometimes 20 persons of both sexes and all ages sleep promiscuously on the floor in different degrees of nakedness. These places are, generally, as regards dirt, damp and decay, such as no person would stable his horse in. And in another place, the wynds of Glasgow house a fluctuating population of between 15,000 and 30,000 persons. This district is composed of many narrow streets and square courts, and in the middle of each court there is a dunghill. Although the outward appearance of these places was revolting, I was nevertheless quite unprepared for the filth and misery that were to be found inside. In some of these bedrooms we, i.e., Police Superintendent Captain Miller and Simons, visited at night, we found a whole mass of humanity stretched out on the floor. There were often 15 to 20 men and women huddled together, some being clothed and others naked. Their bed was a heap of musty straw mixed with rags. There was hardly any furniture there, and the only thing which gave these holes the appearance of a dwelling was fire burning on the hearth. Thieving and prostitution are the main sources of income of these people. No one seems to have taken the trouble to clean out these organ stables, this pandemonium, this nucleus of crime, filth and pestilence in the second city of the empire. A detailed investigation of the most wretched slums of other towns has never revealed anything half so bad as this concentration of moral iniquity, physical degradation and gross overcrowding. In this part of Glasgow most of the houses have been condemned by the Court of Guild as dilapidated and uninhabitable, but it is just these dwellings which are filled to overflowing, because, by law, no rent can be charged on them. The great manufacturing district in the centre of the British Islands, the thickly peopled stretch of West Yorkshire and South Lancashire, with its numerous factory towns, yields nothing to the other great manufacturing centres. The wool district of the West Riding of Yorkshire is a charming region. A beautiful green hill country, whose elevations grow more rugged towards the west until they reach their highest point in the bold ridge of Blackstone Edge, the watershed between the Irish Sea and the German Ocean, the valleys of the Aire, along which stretches Leeds, and of the Calder, through which the Manchester-Leeds Railway runs, are among the most attractive in England, and are strewn in all directions with the factories, villages, and towns. The houses of rough grey stone look so neat and clean in comparison with the blackened brick buildings of Lancashire, that it is a pleasure to look at them. But on coming into the towns themselves, one finds little to rejoice over. Leeds lies, as the artisan describes it, and as I found confirmed upon examination, on a slope running down towards the River Aire, which meanders about a mile and a half through the town, and is liable to overflows during thaws or after heavy rains. The higher or western districts are clean for so large a town, but the lower parts contiguous to the river and its becks or rivulets are dirty, confined, and, in themselves, sufficient to shorten life, especially infant life. Add to this the disgusting state of the lower parts of the town about Kirkgate, March Lane, Cross Street and Richmond Road, principally owing to a general want of paving and draining, irregularity of building, the abundance of courts and blind alleys, as well as the almost total absence of the commonest means for promoting cleanliness, and we have then quite sufficient data to account for the surplus mortality in these unhappy regions of filth and misery. In consequence of the floods from the Aire, which, it must be added, like all other rivers in the service of manufacture, flows into the city at one end clear and transparent, and flows out at the other end thick, black, and foul, smelling of all possible refuse, the dwelling houses and cellars are not infrequently so inundated that the water has to be pumped out by hand pumps, onto the surface of the streets. And at such times, even where there are sewers, the water rises through them into the cellars, 9. Creating miasmatic exhalations, strongly charged with sulfuretted hydrogen, and leaving offensive refuse, exceedingly prejudicial to human health. Indeed, during a season of inundation in the spring of 1859, so fatal were the effects of such an engorgement of the sewers, that the Registrar of the North District made a report, that during that quarter there were, in that neighbourhood, 2 births to 3 deaths, whilst in all the other districts there were 3 to 2 deaths. Other populous districts are wholly without sewers, or so inadequately provided as to derive no advantage therefrom. In some rows of houses, the cellar dwellings are seldom dry. In certain districts there are several streets covered with soft mud a foot deep. The inhabitants have from time to time vainly attempted to repair these streets with shovelfuls of ashes and soil, refuse water, etc., stand in every hole, there to remain until absorbed by wind or sun. An ordinary cottage, in Leeds, extends over no more than about 5 yards square, and consists usually of a cellar, a sitting room, and a sleeping chamber. This small size of the houses crammed with human beings both day and night, is another point dangerous alike to the morals and the health of the inhabitants. And how greatly these cottages are crowded, the report on the health of the working classes, quoted above, bears testimony. In Leeds, brothers and sisters, and lodgers of both sexes, are found occupying the same sleeping room with the parents, and consequences occur which humanity shudders to contemplate. So, too, Bradford, which, but 7 miles from Leeds at the junction of several valleys, lies upon the banks of a small, coal-black, foul-smelling stream. On weekdays the town is enveloped in a grey cloud of coal smoke, but on a fine Sunday it offers a superb picture, when viewed from the surrounding heights. Yet within reigns the same filth and discomfort as in Leeds. The older portions of the town are built upon steep hillsides, and are narrow and irregular. In the lanes, alleys, and courts lie filth and debris in heaps. The houses are ruinous, dirty, and miserable, and in the immediate vicinity of the river and the valley bottom I found many a one whose ground floor, half buried in the hillside, was totally abandoned. In general, the portions of the valley bottom in which working men's cottages have crowded between the tall factories, are among the worst built and dirtiest districts of the whole town. In the newer portions of this, as of every other factory town, the cottages are more regular, being built in rows, but they share here, too, all the evils incident to the customary method of providing working men's dwellings, evils of which we shall have occasions to speak more particularly in discussing Manchester. The same is true of the remaining towns of the West Riding, especially of Barnsley, Halifax, and Huddersfield. The last named, the handsomest by far of all the factory towns of Yorkshire and Lancashire by reason of its charming situation and modern architecture, has yet its bad quarter, for a committee appointed by a meeting of citizens to survey the town reported August 5, 1844. It is notorious that there are whole streets in the town of Huddersfield, and many courts and alleys, which are neither flagged, paved, sewered, nor drained, where garbage and filth of every description are left on the surface to ferment and rot, where pools of stagnant water are almost constant, where the dwellings adjoining are thus necessarily caused to be of an inferior and even filthy description, thus where disease is engendered, and the health of the whole town perilled. If we cross Blackstone Edge or penetrate it with the railroad, we enter upon that classic soil on which English manufacture has achieved its masterwork and from which all labour movements emanate, namely, South Lancashire with its central city Manchester. Again we have beautiful hill country, sloping gently from the watershed westwards towards the Irish Sea, with the charming green valleys of the Ribble, the Irwell, the Mersey, and their tributaries, a country which, 100 years ago chiefly swamp land, thinly populated, is now sown with towns and villages, and is the most densely populated strip of country in England. In Lancashire, and especially in Manchester, English manufacture finds at once its starting point and its centre. The Manchester Exchange is the thermometer for all the fluctuations of trade. The modern art of manufacture has reached its perfection in Manchester. In the cotton industry of South Lancashire, the application of the forces of nature, the superseding of hand labor by machinery, especially by the power loom and the self-acting mule, and the division of labor, are seen at the highest point. And, if we recognize in these three elements that which is characteristic of modern manufacture, we must confess that the cotton industry has remained in advance of all other branches of industry from the beginning down to the present day. The effects of modern manufacture upon the working class must necessarily develop here most freely and perfectly, and the manufacturing proletariat present itself in its fullest classic perfection. The degradation to which the application of steam power, machinery and the division of labor reduce the working man, and the attempts of the proletariat to rise above this abasement, must likewise be carried to the highest point and with the fullest consciousness. Hence, because Manchester is the classic type of a modern manufacturing town, and because I know it as intimately as my own native town, more intimately than most of its residents know it, we shall make a longer stay here. The towns surrounding Manchester vary little from the central city, so far as the working people's quarters are concerned, except that the working class forms, if possible, a larger proportion of their population. These towns are purely industrial and conduct all their business through Manchester, upon which they are in every respect dependent, whence they are inhabited only by working men and petty tradesmen, while Manchester has a very considerable commercial population, especially of commission and respectable retail dealers. Hence Bolton, Preston, Wigan, Bury, Rochdale, Middleton, Haywood, Oldham, Ashton, Stalybridge, Stockport, etc. Though nearly all towns of 30, 50, 70 to 90,000 inhabitants are almost wholly working people's districts, interspersed only with factories, a few thoroughfares lined with shops, and a few lanes along which the gardens and houses of the manufacturers are scattered like villas. The towns themselves are badly and irregularly built, with foul courts, lanes, and back alleys, reeking of coal smoke, and especially dingy from the originally bright red brick, turned black with time, which is here the universal building material. Cellar dwellings are general here. Wherever it is in any way possible, these subterranean dens are constructed, and a very considerable portion of the population dwells in them. Among the worst of these towns after Preston and Oldham is Bolton, 11 miles northwest of Manchester. It has, so far as I have been able to observe in my repeated visits, but one main street, a very dirty one, Deansgate, which serves as a market, and is even in the finest weather a dark, unattractive hole, in spite of the fact that, except for the factories, its sides are formed by low 1- and 2-storied houses. Here, as everywhere, the older part of the town is especially ruinous and miserable. A dark-colored body of water, which leaves the beholder in doubt whether it is a brook or a long string of stagnant puddles, flows through the town and contributes its share to the total pollution of the air, by no means pure without it. There is Stockport, too, which lies on the Cheshire side of the Mersey, but belongs nevertheless to the manufacturing district of Manchester. It lies in a narrow valley along the Mersey, so that the streets slope down a steep hill on one side and up an equally steep one on the other, while the railway from Manchester to Birmingham passes over a high viaduct above the city and the whole valley. Stockport is renowned throughout the entire district as one of the duskiest, smokiest holes, and looks, indeed, especially when viewed from the viaduct, excessively repellent. But far more repulsive are the cottages and cellar dwellings of the working class, which stretch in long rows through all parts of the town from the valley bottom to the crest of the hill. I do not remember to have seen so many cellars used as dwellings in any other town of this district. A few miles northeast of Stockport is Ashton-under-Lyne, one of the newest factory towns of this region. It stands on the slope of a hill at the foot of which are the canal and the River Tame, and is, in general, built on the newer, more regular plan. 5 or 6 parallel streets stretch along the hill, intersected at right angles by others leading down into the valley. By this method, the factories would be excluded from the town proper, even if the proximity of the river and the canal way did not draw them all into the valley, where they stand thickly crowded, belching forth black smoke from their chimneys. To this arrangement Ashton owes a much more attractive appearance than that of most factory towns. The streets are broader and cleaner, the cottages look new, bright red, and comfortable. But the modern system of building cottages for working men has its own disadvantages. Every street has its concealed back lane to which a narrow paved path leads, and which is all the dirtier. And, although I saw no buildings, except a few on entering, which could have been more than 50 years old, there are even in Ashton streets in which the cottages are getting bad, where the bricks in the house corners are no longer firm but shift about, in which the walls have cracks and will not hold the chalk whitewash inside. Streets, whose dirty, smoke-begrimed aspect is nowise different from that of the other towns of the district, except that in Ashton this is the exception, not the rule. A mile eastward lies Stalybridge, also on the Tame. In coming over the hill from Ashton, the traveller has, at the top, both right and left, fine large gardens with superb villa-like houses in their midst, built usually in the Elizabethan style, which is to the Gothic precisely what the Anglican Church is to the Apostolic Roman Catholic. 100 paces farther and Stalybridge shows itself in the valley, in sharp contrast with the beautiful country seats, in sharp contrast even with the modest cottages of Ashton. Stalybridge lies in a narrow, crooked ravine, much narrower even than the valley at Stockport, and both sides of this ravine are occupied by an irregular group of cottages, houses, and mills. On entering, the very first cottages are narrow, smoke-begrimed, old and ruinous. And as the first houses, so the whole town. A few streets lie in the narrow valley bottom, most of them run criss-cross, pell-mell, uphill and down, and in nearly all the houses, by reason of this sloping situation, the ground floor is half buried in the earth. And what multitudes of courts, back lanes, and remote nooks arise out of this confused way of building may be seen from the hills, whence one has the town, here and there, in a bird's eye view almost at one's feet. Add to this the shocking filth, and the repulsive effect of Stalybridge, in spite of its pretty surroundings, may be readily imagined. Engels' map of Manchester. But enough of these little towns. Each has its own peculiarities, but in general, the working people live in them just as in Manchester. Hence I have especially sketched only their peculiar construction, and would observe that all more general observations as to the condition of the labouring population in Manchester are fully applicable to these surrounding towns as well. Manchester lies at the foot of the southern slope of a range of hills, which stretch hither from Oldham, their last peak, Kersallmoor, being at once the race course and the Mons Sacer of Manchester. Manchester proper lies on the left bank of the Irwell, between that stream and the two smaller ones, the Irk and the Medlock, which here empty into the Irwell. On the right bank of the Irwell, bounded by a sharp curve of the river, lies Salford, and farther westward Pendleton. Northward from the Irwell lie Upper and Lower Broughton. Northward of the Irk, Cheetham Hill, south of the Medlock lies Hume. Farther east Chorlton on Medlock, still farther, pretty well to the east of Manchester, Ardwick. The whole assemblage of buildings is commonly called Manchester, and contains about 400,000 inhabitants, rather more than less. The town itself is peculiarly built, so that a person may live in it for years, and go in and out daily without coming into contact with a working people's quarter or even with workers, that is, so long as he confines himself to his business or to pleasure walks. This arises chiefly from the fact, that by unconscious tacit agreement, as well as with outspoken conscious determination, the working people's quarters are sharply separated from the sections of the city reserved for the middle class. Or, if this does not succeed, they are concealed with the cloak of charity. Manchester contains, at its heart, a rather extended commercial district, perhaps half a mile long and about as broad, and consisting almost wholly of offices and warehouses. Nearly the whole district is abandoned by dwellers, and is lonely and deserted at night. Only watchmen and policemen traverse its narrow lanes with their dark lanterns. This district is cut through by certain main thoroughfares upon which the vast traffic concentrates, and in which the ground level is lined with brilliant shops. In these streets the upper floors are occupied, here and there, and there is a good deal of life upon them until late at night. With the exception of this commercial district, all Manchester proper, all Salford and Hume, a great part of Pendleton and Chorlton, 2/3 of Ardwick, and single stretches of Cheetham Hill and Broughton are all unmixed working people's quarters, stretching like a girdle, averaging 1.5 miles in breadth, around the commercial district. Outside, beyond this girdle, lives the upper and middle bourgeoisie, the middle bourgeoisie in regularly laid out streets in the vicinity of the working quarters, especially in Chorlton and the lower lying portions of Cheetham Hill. The upper bourgeoisie in remoter villas with gardens in Chorlton and Ardwick, or on the breezy heights of Cheetham Hill, Broughton, and Pendleton, in free, wholesome country air, in fine, comfortable homes, passed once every half or quarter hour by omnibuses going into the city. And the finest part of the arrangement is this, that the members of this money aristocracy can take the shortest road through the middle of all the laboring districts to their places of business without ever seeing that they are in the midst of the grimy misery that lurks to the right and the left. For the thoroughfares leading from the exchange in all directions out of the city are lined, on both sides, with an almost unbroken series of shops, and are so kept in the hands of the middle and lower bourgeoisie, which, out of self-interest, cares for a decent and cleanly external appearance and can care for it. True, these shops bear some relation to the districts which lie behind them, and are more elegant in the commercial and residential quarters than when they hide grimy working men's dwellings. But they suffice to conceal from the eyes of the wealthy men and women of strong stomachs and weak nerves the misery and grime which form the complement of their wealth. So, for instance, Deansgate, which leads from the old church directly southward, is lined first with mills and warehouses, then with second-rate shops and alehouses. Farther south, when it leaves the commercial district, with less inviting shops, which grow dirtier and more interrupted by beerhouses and gin palaces the farther one goes, until at the southern end the appearance of the shops leaves no doubt that workers and workers only are their customers. So Market Street running southeast from the exchange. At first brilliant shops are the best sort, with counting houses or warehouses above. In the continuation, Piccadilly, immense hotels and warehouses. In the farther continuation, London Road, in the neighbourhood of the Medlock, factories, beerhouses, shops for the humbler bourgeoisie and the working populations. And from this point onward, large gardens and villas of the wealthier merchants and manufacturers. In this way anyone who knows Manchester can infer the adjoining districts from the appearance of the thoroughfare, but one is seldom in a position to catch from the street a glimpse of the real labouring districts. I know very well that this hypocritical plan is more or less common to all great cities. I know, too, that the retail dealers are forced by the nature of their business to take possession of the great highways. I know that there are more good buildings than bad ones upon such streets everywhere, and that the value of land is greater near them than in remoter districts. But at the same time I have never seen so systematic a shutting out of the working class from the thoroughfares, so tender a concealment of everything which might affront the eye and the nerves of the bourgeoisie, as in Manchester. And yet, in other respects, Manchester is less built according to a plan, after officials' regulations, is more an outgrowth of accident than any other city, and when I consider in this connection the eager assurances of the middle class, that the working class is doing famously, I cannot help feeling that the liberal manufacturers, the big-wigs, of Manchester, are not so innocent after all, in the matter of this shameful method of construction. I may mention just here that the mills almost all adjoin the rivers or the different canals that ramify throughout the city, before I proceed at once to describe the labouring quarters. First of all, there is the old town of Manchester, which lies between the northern boundary of the commercial district and the Irk. Here the streets, even the better ones, are narrow and winding, as Todd Street, Long Millgate, Withy Grove, and Shude Hill, the houses dirty, old, and tumble down, and the construction of the side streets utterly horrible. Going from the old church to Long Millgate, the stroller has at once a row of old-fashioned houses at the right, of which not one has kept its original level. These are remnants of the old pre-manufacturing Manchester, whose former inhabitants have removed with their descendants into better-built districts, and have left the houses, which were not good enough for them, to a population strongly mixed with Irish blood. Here one is in an almost undisguised working men's quarter, for even the shops and beerhouses hardly take the trouble to exhibit a trifling degree of cleanliness. But all this is nothing in comparison with the courts and lanes which lie behind, to which access can be gained only through covered passages, in which no two human beings can pass at the same time. Of the irregular cramming together of dwellings in ways which defy all rational plan, of the tangle in which they are crowded literally one upon the other, it is impossible to convey an idea. And it is not the buildings surviving from the old times of Manchester which are to blame for this. The confusion has only recently reached its height when every scrap of space left by the old way of building has been filled up and patched over until not a foot of land is left to be further occupied. Engels' sketch. To confirm my statement, I have drawn here a small section of the plan of Manchester, not the worst spot and not 1/10 of the whole old town. This drawing will suffice to characterize the irrational manner in which the entire district was built, particularly the part near the Irk. The south bank of the Irk is here very steep and between 15 and 30 feet high. On this declivitous hillside there are planted 3 rows of houses, of which the lowest rise directly out of the river, while the front walls of the highest stand on the crest of the hill in Long Millgate. Among them are mills on the river. In short, the method of construction is as crowded and disorderly here as in the lower part of Long Millgate. Right and left a multitude of covered passages led from the main street into numerous courts, and he who turns in thither gets into a filth and disgusting grime, the equal of which is not to be found, especially in the courts which lead down to the Irk, and which contain unqualifiedly the most horrible dwellings which I have yet beheld. In one of these courts there stands directly at the entrance, at the end of the covered passage, a privy without a door, so dirty that the inhabitants can pass into and out of the court only by passing through foul pools of stagnant urine and excrement. This is the first court on the Irk above Ducie Bridge, in case any one should care to look into it. Below it on the river there are several tanneries which fill the whole neighborhood with the stench of animal putrefaction. Below Ducie Bridge the only entrance to most of the houses is by means of narrow, dirty stairs and over heaps of refuse and filth. The first court below Ducie Bridge, known as Allen's Court, was in such a state at the time of the cholera that the sanitary police ordered it evacuated, swept, and disinfected with chloride of lime. Dr. K gives a terrible description of the state of this court at that time. Since then, it seems to have been partially torn away and rebuilt. At least looking down from Ducie Bridge, the passer-by sees several ruined walls and heaps of debris with some newer houses. The view from this bridge, mercifully concealed from mortals of small stature by a parapet as high as a man, is characteristic for the whole district. At the bottom flows, or rather stagnates, the Irk, a narrow, coal-black, foul-smelling stream, full of debris and refuse, which it deposits on the shallower right bank. In dry weather, a long string of the most disgusting, blackish-green, slime pools are left standing on this bank, from the depths of which bubbles of miasmatic gas constantly arise and give forth a stench unendurable even on the bridge 40 or 50 feet above the surface of the stream. But besides this, the stream itself is checked every few paces by high weirs, behind which slime and refuse accumulate and rot in thick masses. Above the bridge are tanneries, bone mills, and gasworks, from which all drains and refuse find their way into the Irk, which receives further the contents of all the neighboring sewers and privies. It may be easily imagined, therefore, what sort of residue the stream deposits. Below the bridge you look upon the piles of debris, the refuse, filth, and offal from the courts on the steep left bank. Here each house is packed close behind its neighbor and a piece of each is visible, all black, smoky, crumbling, ancient, with broken panes and window frames. The background is furnished by old barrack-like factory buildings. On the lower right bank stands a long row of houses and mills. The second house being a ruin without a roof, piled with debris, the third stands so low that the lowest floor is uninhabitable, and therefore without windows or doors. Here the background embraces the pauper burial ground, the station of the Liverpool and Leeds Railway, and, in the rear of this, the workhouse, the Port Law Bastille, of Manchester, which, like a citadel, looks threateningly down from behind its high walls and parapets on the hilltop, upon the working people a quarter below. Above Ducie Bridge, the left bank grows more flat and the right bank steeper, but the condition of the dwellings on both banks grows worse rather than better. He who turns to the left here from the main street, Long Millgate, is lost. He wanders from one court to another, turns countless corners, passes nothing but narrow, filthy nooks and alleys, until after a few minutes he has lost all clue, and knows not whither to turn. Everywhere half or wholly ruined buildings, some of them actually uninhabited, which means a great deal here. Rarely a wooden or stone floor to be seen in the houses, almost uniformly broken, ill-fitting windows and doors, and a state of filth. Everywhere heaps of debris, refuse, and offal, standing pools for gutters, and a stench which alone would make it impossible for a human being in any degree civilized to live in such a district. The newly built extension of the Leeds Railway, which crosses the Irk here, has swept away some of these courts and lanes, laying others completely open to view. Immediately under the railway bridge there stands a court, the filth and horrors of which surpass all the others by far, just because it was hitherto so shut off, so secluded that the way to it could not be found without a good deal of trouble. I should never have discovered it myself, without the breaks made by the railway, though I thought I knew this whole region thoroughly. Passing along a rough bank, among stakes and washing lines, one penetrates into this chaos of small one-storied, one-roomed huts, in most of which there is no artificial floor. Kitchen, living and sleeping room all in one. In such a hole, scarcely 5 feet long by 6 broad, I found 2 beds, and such bedsteads and beds, which, with a staircase and chimney place, exactly filled the room. In several others I found absolutely nothing, while the door stood open, and the inhabitants leaned against it. Everywhere before the doors refuse an offal, that any sort of pavement lay underneath could not be seen but only felt, here and there, with the feet. This whole collection of cattle sheds for human beings was surrounded on 2 sides by houses and a factory, and on the third by the river, and besides the narrow stair up the bank, a narrow doorway alone led out into another almost equally ill-built, ill-kept labyrinth of dwellings. Enough. The whole side of the Irk is built in this way, a planless, knotted chaos of houses, more or less on the verge of uninhabitableness, whose unclean interiors fully correspond with their filthy external surroundings. And how could the people be clean with no proper opportunity for satisfying the most natural and ordinary wants? Privies are so rare here that they are either filled up every day, or are too remote for most of the inhabitants to use. How can people wash when they have only the dirty Irk water at hand, while pumps and water pipes can be found in decent parts of the city alone? In truth, it cannot be charged to the account of these helots a modern society if their dwellings are not more cleanly than the pig-sties which are here and there to be seen among them. The landlords are not ashamed to let dwellings like the 6 or 7 cellars on the quay directly below Scotland Bridge, the floors of which stand at least 2 feet below the low water level of the Irk that flows not 6 feet away from them. Or like the upper floor of the corner house on the opposite shore directly above the bridge, where the ground floor, utterly uninhabitable, stands deprived of all fittings for doors and windows, a case by no means rare in this region, when this open ground floor is used as a privy by the whole neighborhood for want of other facilities. If we leave the Irk and penetrate once more on the opposite side from Long Millgate into the midst of the working men's dwellings, we shall come into a somewhat newer quarter, which stretches from St. Michael's Church to Withy Grove and Shude Hill. Here there is somewhat better order. In place of the chaos of buildings, we find at least long straight lanes and alleys or courts, built according to a plan and usually square. But if, in the former case, every house was built according to caprice, here each lane and court is so built, without reference to the situation of the adjoining ones. The lanes run now in this direction, now in that, while every 2 minutes the wanderer gets into a blind alley, or, on turning a corner, finds himself back where he started from. Certainly no one who has not lived a considerable time in this labyrinth can find his way through it. If I may use the word at all in speaking of this district, the ventilation of these streets and courts is, in consequence of this confusion, quite as imperfect as in the Irk region. And if this quarter may, nevertheless, be said to have some advantage over that of the Irk, the houses being newer and the streets occasionally having gutters, nearly every house has, on the other hand, a cellar dwelling, which is rarely found in the Irk district, by reason of the greater age and more careless construction of the houses. As for the rest, the filth, debris, and offal heaps, and the pools in the streets are common to both quarters, and in the district now under discussion. Another feature most injurious to the cleanliness of the inhabitants, is the multitude of pigs walking about in all the alleys, rooting into the offal heaps, or kept imprisoned in small pens. Here, as in most of the working men's quarters of Manchester, the pork raisers rent the courts and build pig pens in them. In almost every court one or even several such pens may be found, into which the inhabitants of the court throw all refuse and offal, whence the swine grow fat. And the atmosphere, confined on all 4 sides, is utterly corrupted by putrefying animal and vegetable substances. Through this quarter, a broad and measurably decent street has been cut, Miller's Street, and the background has been pretty successfully concealed. But if anyone should be led by curiosity to pass through one of the numerous passages which led into the courts, he will find this piggery repeated at every 20 paces. Such is the old town of Manchester, and on rereading my description, I am forced to admit that instead of being exaggerated, it is far from black enough to convey a true impression of the filth, ruin, and uninhabitableness, the defiance of all considerations of cleanliness, ventilation, and health which characterize the construction of this single district, containing at least 20 to 30,000 inhabitants. And such a district exists in the heart of the second city of England, the first manufacturing city of the world. If anyone wishes to see in how little space a human being can move, how little air, and such air, he can breathe, how little of civilization he may share and yet live, it is only necessary to travel hither. True, this is the old town, and the people of Manchester emphasize the fact whenever anyone mentions to them the frightful condition of this hell upon earth. But what does that prove? Everything which here arouses horror and indignation is of recent origin, belongs to the industrial epoch. The couple of hundred houses, which belong to old Manchester, have been long since abandoned by their original inhabitants. The industrial epoch alone has crammed into them the swarms of workers whom they now shelter. The industrial epoch alone has built up every spot between these old houses to win a covering for the masses whom it has conjured hither from the agricultural districts and from Ireland. The industrial epoch alone enables the owners of these cattle sheds to rent them for high prices to human beings, to plunder the poverty of the workers, to undermine the health of thousands, in order that they alone, the owners, may grow rich. In the industrial epoch alone has it become possible that the worker scarcely freed from feudal servitude could be used as mere material, a mere chattel. That he must let himself be crowded into a dwelling too bad for every other, which he for his hard-earned wages buys the right to let go utterly to ruin. This manufacture has achieved, which, without these workers, this poverty, this slavery could not have lived. True, the original construction of this quarter was bad, little good could have been made out of it. But, have the landowners, has the municipality done anything to improve it when rebuilding? On the contrary, wherever a nook or corner was free, a house has been run up. Where a superfluous passage remained, it has been built up. The value of land rose with the blossoming out of manufacture, and the more it rose, the more madly was the work of building up carried on, without reference to the health or comfort of the inhabitants, with sole reference to the highest possible profit on the principle that no hole is so bad but that some poor creature must take it who can pay for nothing better. However, it is the old town, and with this reflection the bourgeoisie is comforted. Let us see, therefore, how much better it is in the new town. The new town, known also as Irish Town, stretches up a hill of clay, beyond the old town, between the Irk and St. George's Road. Here all the features of a city are lost. Single rows of houses or groups of streets stand, here and there, like little villages on the naked, not even grass-grown clay soil. The houses, or rather cottages, are in bad order, never repaired, filthy, with damp, unclean, cellar dwellings. The lanes are neither paved nor supplied with sewers, but harbor numerous colonies of swine penned in small sties or yards, or wandering unrestrained through the neighborhood. The mud in the streets is so deep that there is never a chance, except in the driest weather, of walking without sinking into it ankle deep at every step. In the vicinity of St. George's Road, the separate groups of buildings approach each other more closely, ending in a continuation of lanes, blind alleys, back lanes and courts, which grow more and more crowded and irregular the nearer they approach the heart of the town. True, they are here oftener paved or supplied with paved sidewalks and gutters, but the filth, the bad order of the houses, and especially of the cellars, remain the same. Engels' sketch. It may not be out of place to make some general observations just here as to the customary construction of working men's quarters in Manchester. We have seen how in the old town pure accident determined the grouping of the houses in general. Every house is built without reference to any other, and the scraps of space between them are called courts for want of another name. In the somewhat newer portions of the same quarter, and in other working men's quarters, dating from the early days of industrial activity, a somewhat more orderly arrangement may be found. The space between two streets is divided into more regular, usually square courts. These courts were built in this way from the beginning, and communicate with the streets by means of covered passages. If the totally planless construction is injurious to the health of the workers by preventing ventilation, this method of shutting them up in courts surrounded on all sides by buildings is far more so. The air simply cannot escape. The chimneys of the houses are the sole drains for the imprisoned atmosphere of the courts, and they serve the purpose only so long as fire is kept burning. 11. Moreover, the houses surrounding such courts are usually built back to back, having the rear wall in common. And this alone suffices to prevent any sufficient through ventilation. And, as the police charged with care of the streets does not trouble itself about the condition of these courts, as everything quietly lies where it is thrown, there is no cause for wonder at the filth and heaps of ashes and offal to be found here. I have been in courts, in Miller's Street, at least half a foot below the level of the thoroughfare, and without the slightest drainage for the water that accumulates in them in rainy weather. More recently another different method of building was adopted, and has now become general. Working men's cottages are almost never built singly, but always by the dozen or score. A single contractor building up one or two streets at a time. These are then arranged as follows. One front is formed of cottages of the best class, so fortunate as to possess a back door and small court, and these command the highest rent. In the rear of these cottages runs a narrow alley, the back street, built up at both ends, into which either a narrow roadway or a covered passage leads from one side. The cottages which face this back street command least rent, and are most neglected. These have their rear walls in common with the third row of cottages, which face a second street and command less rent than the first row and more than the second. The streets are laid out somewhat in the following manner. Engels' sketch. By this method of construction, comparatively good ventilation can be obtained for the first row of cottages, and the third row is no worse off than in the former method. The middle row, on the other hand, is at least as badly ventilated as the houses in the courts, and the back street is always in the same filthy, disgusting condition as they. The contractors prefer this method because it saves them space, and furnishes the means of fleecing better paid workers through the higher rents of the cottages in the first and third rows. These three different forms of cottage building are found all over Manchester and throughout Lancashire and Yorkshire, often mixed up together, but usually separate enough to indicate the relative age of parts of towns. The third system, that of the back alleys, prevails largely in the great working men's district east of St. George's Road and Ancoats Street, and is the one most often found in the other working men's quarters of Manchester and its suburbs. In the last mentioned broad district included under the name Ancoats, stand the largest mills of Manchester lining the canals, colossal 6- and 7-storied buildings towering with their slender chimneys far above the low cottages of the workers. The population of the district consists, therefore, chiefly of mill hands, and in the worst streets, of hand weavers. The streets nearest the heart of the town are the oldest, and consequently the worst. They are, however, paved, and supplied with drains. Among them I include those nearest to and parallel with Oldham Road and Great Ancoats Street. Farther to the northeast lie many newly built-up streets. Here the cottages look neat and cleanly, doors and windows are new and freshly painted, the rooms within newly whitewashed. The streets themselves are better aired, the vacant building lots between them larger and more numerous. But this can be said of a minority of the houses only, while cellar dwellings are to be found under almost every cottage. Many streets are unpaved and without sewers, and, worse than all, this neat appearance is all pretense, a pretense which vanishes within the first 10 years. For the construction of the cottages individually is no less to be condemned than the plan of the streets. All such cottages look neat and substantial at first. Their massive brick walls deceive the eye, and, on passing through a newly built working men's street, without remembering the back alleys and the construction of the houses themselves, one is inclined to agree with the assertion of the liberal manufacturers that the working population is nowhere so well housed as in England. But on closer examination, it becomes evident that the walls of these cottages are as thin as it is possible to make them. The outer walls, those of the cellar, which bear the weight of the ground floor and roof, are 1 whole brick thick at most, the bricks lying with their long sides touching bricks 1. But I have seen many a cottage of the same height, some in process of building, whose outer walls were but 1/2 brick thick, the bricks lying not sidewise but lengthwise, their narrow ends touching bricks 2. The object of this is to spare material, but there is also another reason for it. Namely, the fact that the contractors never own the land but lease it, according to the English custom, for 20, 30, 40, 50, or 99 years, at the expiration of which time it falls, with everything upon it, back into the possession of the original holder, who pays nothing in return for improvements upon it. The improvements are therefore so calculated by the lessee as to be worth as little as possible at the expiration of the stipulated term. And as such cottages are often built but 20 or 30 years before the expiration of the term, it may easily be imagined that the contractors make no unnecessary expenditures upon them. Moreover, these contractors, usually carpenters and builders, or manufacturers, spend little or nothing in repairs, partly to avoid diminishing their rent receipts, and partly in view of the approaching surrender of the improvement to the landowner. While in consequence of commercial crises and the loss of work that follows them, whole streets often stand empty, the cottages falling rapidly into ruin and uninhabitableness. It is calculated in general that working men's cottages last only 40 years on the average. This sounds strangely enough when one sees the beautiful, massive walls of newly built ones, which seem to give promise of lasting a couple of centuries. But the fact remains that the niggardliness of the original expenditure, the neglect of all repairs, the frequent periods of emptiness, the constant change of inhabitants, and the destruction carried on by the dwellers during the final 10 years, usually Irish families, who do not hesitate to use the wooden portions for firewood, all this, taken together, accomplishes the complete ruin of the cottages by the end of 40 years. Hence it comes that Ancoats, built chiefly since the sudden growth of manufacture, chiefly indeed within the present century, contains a vast number of ruinous houses, most of them being, in fact, in the last stages of inhabitableness. I will not dwell upon the amount of capital thus wasted, the small additional expenditure upon the original improvement and upon repairs which would suffice to keep this whole district clean, decent, and inhabitable for years together. I have to deal here with the state of the houses and their inhabitants, and it must be admitted that no more injurious and demoralizing method of housing the workers has yet been discovered than precisely this. The working man is constrained to occupy such ruinous dwellings because he cannot pay for others, and because there are no others in the vicinity of his mill. Perhaps, too, because they belong to the employer, who engages him only on condition of his taking such a cottage. The calculation with reference to the 40 years' duration of the cottage is, of course, not always perfectly strict. For, if the dwellings are in a thickly built-up portion of the town, and there is a good prospect of finding steady occupants for them, while the ground rent is high, the contractors do a little something to keep the cottages inhabitable after the expiration of the 40 years. They never do anything more, however, than is absolutely unavoidable, and the dwellings so repaired are the worst of all. Occasionally when an epidemic threatens, the otherwise sleepy conscience of the sanitary police is a little stirred, raids are made into the working men's districts, whole rows of cellars and cottages are closed, as happened in the case of several lanes near Oldham Road. But this does not last long. The condemned cottages soon find occupants again, the owners are much better off by letting them, and the sanitary police won't come again so soon. These east and northeast sides of Manchester are the only ones on which the bourgeoisie has not built, because 10 or 11 months of the year the west and southwest wind drives the smoke of all the factories hither, and that the working people alone may breathe. Southward from Great Ancoats Street lies a great, straggling, working men's quarter, a hilly, barren stretch of land, occupied by detached, irregularly built rows of houses or squares. Between these, empty building lots, uneven, clayey, without grass and scarcely passable in wet weather. The cottages are all filthy and old, and recall the new town to mind. The stretch cut through by the Birmingham Railway is the most thickly built up and the worst. Here flows the Medlock with countless windings through a valley, which is, in places, on a level with the valley of the Irk. Along both sides of the stream, which is coal-black, stagnant and foul, stretches a broad belt of factories and working men's dwellings, the latter all in the worst condition. The bank is chiefly declivitous and is built over to the water's edge, just as we saw along the Irk. While the houses are equally bad, whether built on the Manchester side or in Ardwick, Chorlton, or Hume. But the most horrible spot, if I should describe all the separate spots in detail I should never come to the end, lies on the Manchester side, immediately southwest of Oxford Road, and is known as Little Ireland. In a rather deep hole, in a curve of the Medlock and surrounded on all four sides by tall factories and high embankments, covered with buildings, stand two groups of about 200 cottages, built chiefly back to back, in which live about 4,000 human beings, most of them Irish. The cottages are old, dirty, and of the smallest sort, the streets uneven, fallen into ruts and in part without drains or pavement. Masses of refuse, offal and sickening filth lie among standing pools in all directions. The atmosphere is poisoned by the effluvia from these, and laden and darkened by the smoke of a dozen tall factory chimneys. A horde of ragged women and children swarm about here, as filthy as the swine that thrive upon the garbage heaps and in the puddles. In short, the whole rookery furnishes such a hateful and repulsive spectacle as can hardly be equalled in the worst court on the Irk. The race that lives in these ruinous cottages, behind broken windows, mended with oilskin, sprung doors, and rotten doorposts, or in dark, wet cellars, in measureless filth and stench, in this atmosphere penned in as if with a purpose, this race must really have reached the lowest stage of humanity. This is the impression and the line of thought which the exterior of this district forces upon the beholder. But what must one think when he hears that in each of these pens, containing at most 2 rooms, a garret and perhaps a cellar, on the average 20 human beings live? That in the whole region, for each 120 persons, one usually inaccessible privy is provided. And that in spite of all the preachings of the physicians, in spite of the excitement into which the cholera epidemic plunged the sanitary police by reason of the condition of Little Ireland, in spite of everything, in this year of grace 1844, it is in almost the same state as in 1831. Dr. K asserts that not only the cellars but the first floors of all the houses in this district are damp, that a number of cellars once filled up with earth have now been emptied and are occupied once more by Irish people, that in one cellar the water constantly wells up through a hole stopped with clay, the cellar lying below the river level, so that its occupant, a handloom weaver, had to bail out the water from his dwelling every morning and pour it into the street. Farther down, on the left side of the Medlock, lies Hume, which properly speaking, is one great working people's district, the condition of which coincides almost exactly with that of Ancoats. The more thickly built up regions chiefly bad and approaching ruin, the less populous of more modern structure, but generally sunk in filth. On the other side of the Medlock, in Manchester proper, lies a second great working men's district which stretches on both sides of Deansgate as far as the business quarter, and in certain parts rivals the old town. Especially in the immediate vicinity of the business quarter, between Bridge and Quay Streets, Princess and Peter Streets, the crowded construction exceeds in places the narrowest courts of the old town. Here are long narrow lanes between which run contracted, crooked courts and passages, the entrances to which are so irregular that the explorer is caught in a blind alley at every few steps, or comes out where he least expects to, unless he knows every court and every alley exactly and separately. According to Dr. K, the most demoralized class of all Manchester lived in these ruinous and filthy districts, people whose occupations are thieving and prostitution and, to all appearances, his assertion is still true at the present moment. When the sanitary police made its expedition hither in 1831, it found the uncleanness as great as in Little Ireland or along the Irk, that it is not much better today, I can testify, and among other items, they found in Parliament Street for 380 persons, and in Parliament Passage for 30 thickly populated houses, but a single privy. If we cross the Irwell to Salford, we find on a peninsula formed by the river a town of 80,000 inhabitants, which, properly speaking, is one large working men's quarter, penetrated by a single wide avenue. Salford, once more important than Manchester, was then the leading town of the surrounding district to which it still gives its name, Salford Hundred. Hence it is that an old and therefore very unwholesome, dirty, and ruinous locality is to be found here, lying opposite the old Church of Manchester, and in as bad a condition as the old town on the other side of the Irwell. Farther away from the river lies the newer portion, which is, however, already beyond the limit of its 40 years of cottage life, and therefore ruinous enough. All Salford is built in courts or narrow lanes, so narrow, that they remind me of the narrowest I have ever seen, the little lanes of Genoa. The average construction of Salford is in this respect much worse than that of Manchester, and so, too, in respect to cleanliness. If, in Manchester, the police, from time to time, every 6 or 10 years, makes a raid upon the working people's districts, closes the worst dwellings, and causes the filthiest spots in these Orgine stables to be cleansed, in Salford it seems to have done absolutely nothing. The narrow side lanes and courts of Chapel Street, Greengate, and Gravel Lane have certainly never been cleansed since they were built. Of late, the Liverpool Railway has been carried through the middle of them, over a high viaduct, and has abolished many of the filthiest nooks. But what does that avail? Whoever passes over this viaduct and looks down, sees filth and wretchedness enough. And, if any one takes the trouble to pass through these lanes and glance through the open doors and windows into the houses and cellars, he can convince himself afresh with every step that the workers of Salford live in dwellings in which cleanliness and comfort are impossible. Exactly the same state of affairs is found in the more distant regions of Salford, in Islington, along Regent Road, and back of the Bolton Railway. The working men's dwellings between Oldfield Road and Cross Lane, where a mass of courts and alleys are to be found in the worst possible state, vie with the dwellings of the old town in filth and overcrowding. In this district I found a man, apparently about 60 years old, living in a cow stable. He had constructed a sort of chimney for his square pen, which had neither windows, floor, nor ceiling, had obtained a bedstead and lived there, though the rain dripped through his rotten roof. This man was too old and weak for regular work, and supported himself by removing manure with a hand cart. The dung heaps lay next door to his palace. Such are the various working people's quarters of Manchester as I had occasion to observe them personally during 20 months. If we briefly formulate the result of our wanderings, we must admit that 350,000 working people of Manchester and its environs live, almost all of them, in wretched, damp, filthy cottages, that the streets which surround them are usually in the most miserable and filthy condition, laid out without the slightest reference to ventilation, with reference solely to the profit secured by the contractor. In a word, we must confess that in the working men's dwellings of Manchester, no cleanliness, no convenience, and consequently no comfortable family life is possible. That in such dwellings only a physically degenerate race, robbed of all humanity, degraded, reduced morally and physically to bestiality, could feel comfortable and at home. And I am not alone in making this assertion. We have seen that Dr. K gives precisely the same description, and, though it is superfluous, I quote further the words of a liberal, recognized and highly valued as an authority by the manufacturers, and a fanatical opponent of all independent movements of the workers. 12. But when I went through their i.e., the Manchester operatives' habitations in Irish Town, and Ancoats, and Little Ireland, my only wonder was that tolerable health could be maintained by the inmates of such houses. These towns, for such they are in extent and population, have been erected by small speculators with an utter disregard to everything except immediate profit. A carpenter and a bricklayer club to buy a patch of ground, i.e., they lease it for a number of years, and cover it with what they call houses. In one place we saw a whole street following the course of a ditch, in order to have deeper cellars for people, not for lumber, without the expense of excavations. Not a house in this street escaped cholera. And generally speaking, throughout these suburbs the streets are unpaved, with a dunghill or a pond in the middle, the houses built back to back, without ventilation or drainage, and whole families occupy a corner of a cellar or of a garret. I have already referred to the unusual activity which the sanitary police manifested during the cholera visitation. When the epidemic was approaching, a universal terror seized the bourgeoisie of the city. People remembered the unwholesome dwellings of the poor, and trembled before the certainty that each of these slums would become a center for the plague, whence it would spread desolation in all directions through the houses of the propertied class. A health commission was appointed at once to investigate these districts, and report upon their condition to the town council. Dr. K., himself a member of this commission, who visited in person every separate police district except one, the 11th, quotes extracts from their reports. There were inspected, in all, 6,951 houses, naturally in Manchester proper alone, Salford and the other suburbs being excluded. Of these, 2,565 urgently needed whitewashing within. 960 were out of repair, 959 had insufficient drains. 1,455 were damp, 452 were badly ventilated, 2,221 were without privies. Of the 687 streets inspected, 248 were unpaved, 53 but partially paved, 112 ill-ventilated, 352 containing standing pools, heaps of debris, refuse, etc. To cleanse such an organ stable before the arrival of the cholera was, of course, out of the question. A few of the worst nooks were therefore cleansed, and everything else left as before. In the cleansed spots, as Little Ireland proves, the old filthy condition was naturally restored in a couple of months. As to the internal condition of these houses, the same commission reports a state of things similar to that which we have already met with in London, Edinburgh, and other cities. A whole Irish family is often accommodated on a single bed, and sometimes a heap of filthy straw and a covering of old sacking hide them in one undistinguished heap, debased alike by penury, want of economy and dissolute habits. Frequently the inspectors found two families crowded into one small house, containing only two apartments, one in which they slept, and another in which they ate, and often more than one family lived in a damp cellar, containing only one room, in whose pestilential atmosphere from 12 to 16 persons were crowded. To these fertile sources of disease were sometimes added the keeping of the pigs and other animals in the house, with other nuisances of the most revolting character. We must add that many families, who had but one room for themselves, receive boarders and lodgers in it, that such lodgers of both sexes by no means rarely sleep in the same bed with the married couple, and that the single case of a man and his wife and his adult sister-in-law sleeping in one bed was found, according to the report on the sanitary condition of the labouring population, 6 times repeated in Manchester. Common lodging houses, too, are very numerous. Dr. K gives their number in 1831 as 267 in Manchester proper, and they must have increased greatly since then. Each of these receives from 20 to 30 guests, so that they shelter all told, nightly, from 5 to 7,000 human beings. The character of the houses and their guests is the same as in other cities. 5 to 7 beds in each room lie on the floor, without bedsteads, and on these sleep, mixed indiscriminately, as many persons as apply. What physical and moral atmosphere reigns in these holes I need not state. Each of these houses is a focus of crime, the scene of deeds against which human nature revolts, which would perhaps never have been executed but for this forced centralization of vice. Gaskell 13 gives the number of persons living in cellars in Manchester proper as 20,000. The Weekly Dispatch gives the number, according to official reports, as 12% of the working class, which agrees with Gaskell's number. The workers being estimated at 175,000, 21,000 would form 12% of it. The cellar dwellings in the suburbs are at least as numerous. So that the number of persons living in cellars in Manchester, using its name in the broader sense, is not less than 40 to 50,000. So much for the dwellings of the workers in the largest cities and towns. The manner in which the need of a shelter is satisfied furnishes a standard for the manner in which all other necessities are supplied. That in these filthy holes a ragged, ill-fed population alone can dwell is a safe conclusion, and such is the fact. The clothing of the working people, in the majority of cases, is in a very bad condition. The material used for it is not of the best adapted. Wool and linen have almost vanished from the wardrobe of both sexes, and cotton has taken their place. Shirts are made of bleached or colored cotton goods. The dresses of the women are chiefly of cotton print goods, and woolen petticoats are rarely to be seen on the washline. The men wear chiefly trousers of fustian or other heavy cotton goods, and jackets or coats are the same. Fustian has become the proverbial costume of the working men, who are called fustian jackets, and call themselves so in contrast to the gentlemen who wear broadcloth, which latter words are used as characteristic for the middle class. When Fergus O'Connor, the Chartist leader, came to Manchester during the insurrection of 1842, he appeared, amidst the deafening applause of the working men, in a fustian suit of clothing. Hats are the universal head covering in England, even for working men. Hats are the most diverse forms: round, high, broad-brimmed, narrow-brimmed, or without brims, only the younger men in factory towns wearing caps. Anyone who does not own a hat folds himself a low, square paper cap. The whole clothing of the working class, even assuming it to be in good condition, is little adapted to the climate. The damp air of England, with its sudden changes of temperature, more calculated than any other to give rise to colds, obliges almost the whole middle class to wear flannel next to the skin, about the body, and flannel scarfs and shirts are in almost universal use. Not only is the working class deprived of this precaution, it is scarcely ever in a position to use a thread of woolen clothing. And the heavy cotton goods, though thicker, stiffer, and heavier than woolen clothes, afford much less protection against cold and wet, remain damp much longer because of their thickness and the nature of the stuff, and have nothing of the compact density of fulled woolen cloths. And, if a working man once buys himself a woolen coat for Sunday, he must get it from one of the cheap shops, where he finds bad, so-called devil's dust cloth, manufactured for sale and not for use, and liable to tear or grow threadbare in a fortnight, or he must buy of an old clothes dealer a half-worn coat which has seen its best days, and lasts but a few weeks. Moreover, the working man's clothing is, in most cases, in bad condition, and there is the oft-recurring necessity for placing the best pieces in the pawnbroker's shop. But among very large numbers, especially among the Irish, the prevailing clothing consists of perfect rags often beyond all mending, or so patched that the original color can no longer be detected. Yet the English and Anglo-Irish go on patching, and have carried this art to a remarkable pitch, putting wool or bagging on fustian, or the reverse, it's all the same to them. But the true, transplanted Irish hardly ever patch except in the extremest necessity, when the garment would otherwise fall apart. Ordinarily the rags of the shirt protrude through the rents in the coat or trousers. They wear, as Thomas Carlyle says, 14. A suit of tatters, the getting on or off which is said to be a difficult operation, transacted only in festivals and the high tides of the calendar. The Irish have introduced, too, the custom, previously unknown in England, of going barefoot. In every manufacturing town there is now to be seen a multitude of people, especially women and children, going about barefoot, and their example is gradually being adopted by the poorer English. As with clothing, so with food. The workers get what is too bad for the property-holding class. In the great towns of England everything may be had of the best, but it costs money. And the workman, who must keep house on a couple of pence, cannot afford much expense. Moreover, he usually receives his wages on Saturday evening, for, although a beginning has been made in the payment of wages on Friday, this excellent arrangement is by no means universal. And so he comes to market at 5 or even 7 o'clock, while the buyers of the middle class have had the first choice during the morning, when the market teems with the best of everything. But when the workers reach it, the best has vanished, and, if it was still there, they would probably not be able to buy it. The potatoes which the workers buy are usually poor, the vegetables wilted, the cheese old and of poor quality, the bacon rancid, the meat lean, tough, taken from old, often diseased, cattle, or such as have died a natural death, and not fresh even then, often half decayed. The sellers are usually small hucksters who buy up inferior goods, and can sell them cheaply by reason of their badness. The poorest workers are forced to use still another device to get together the things they need with their few pence. As nothing can be sold on Sunday, and all shops must be closed at 12 o'clock on Saturday night, such things as would not keep until Monday are sold at any price between 10 o'clock and midnight. But 9/10 of what is sold at 10 o'clock is past using by Sunday morning, yet these are precisely the provisions which make up the Sunday dinner of the poorest class. The meat which the workers buy is very often past using. But having bought it, they must eat it. On the 6th of January, 1844, if I am not greatly mistaken, a court leet was held in Manchester, when 11 meat sellers were fined for having sold tainted meat. Each of them had a whole ox or pig, or several sheep, or from 50 to 60 pounds of meat, which were all confiscated in a tainted condition. In one case, 54 stuffed Christmas geese were seized which had proved unsaleable in Liverpool, and had been forwarded to Manchester, where they were brought to market foul and rotten. All the particulars, with names and fines, were published at the time in the Manchester Guardian. In the 6 weeks, from July 1 to August 14, 1844, the same sheet reported 3 similar cases. According to the Guardian for July 3, a pig, weighing 200 pounds, which had been found dead and decayed, was cut up and exposed for sale by a butcher at Haywood, and was then seized. According to the number for July 31, 2 butchers at Wigan, of whom one had previously been convicted of the same offence, were fined £2 and £4 respectively, for exposing tainted meat for sale. And, according to the number for August 10, 26 tainted hams seized at a dealer's in Bolton, were publicly burnt, and the dealer fined 20 shillings. But these are by no means all the cases. They do not even form a fair average for a period of 6 weeks, according to which to form an average for the year. There are often seasons in which every number of the semi-weekly Guardian mentions a similar case found in Manchester or its vicinity. And when one reflects upon the many cases which must escape detection in the extensive markets that stretch along the front of every main street, under the slender supervision of the market inspectors, and how else can one explain the boldness with which whole animals are exposed for sale? When one considers how great the temptation must be, in view of the incomprehensibly small fines mentioned in the foregoing cases. When one reflects what condition a piece of meat must have reached to be seized by the inspectors, it is impossible to believe that the workers obtain good and nourishing meat as a usual thing. But they are victimized in yet another way by the money greed of the middle class. Dealers and manufacturers adulterate all kinds of provisions in an atrocious manner, and without the slightest regard to the health of the consumers. We have heard the Manchester Guardian upon this subject. Let us hear another organ of the middle class. I delight in the testimony of my opponents. Let us hear the Liverpool Mercury. Salt butter is molded into the form of pounds of fresh butter, and cased over with fresh. In other instances a pound of fresh is conspicuously placed to be tasted. But that pound is not sold, and in other instances salt butter, washed, is molded and sold as fresh. Pounded rice and other cheap materials are mixed in sugar, and sold at full monopoly price. A chemical substance, the refuse of the soap manufactories, is also mixed with other substances and sold as sugar. Chicory is mixed in good coffee. Chicory, or some similarly cheap substance, is skillfully molded into the form of the coffee berry, and is mixed with the bulk very liberally. Cocoa is extensively adulterated with fine brown earth, wrought up with mutton fat, so as to amalgamate with portions of the real article. The leaves of tea are mingled with sloe leaves and other abominations. Used leaves are also re-dried, and recolored on hot copper plates, and sold as tea. Pepper is adulterated with dust from husks etc. Port wine is altogether manufactured, from spirits, dyes, etc., it being notorious that more port wine is drunk in this country than is made in Portugal. Nasty things of all sorts are mixed with the weed tobacco in all its manufactured forms. I can add that several of the most respected tobacco dealers in Manchester announced publicly last summer, that, by reason of the universal adulteration of tobacco, no firm could carry on business without adulteration, and that no cigar costing less than 3p is made wholly from tobacco. These frauds are naturally not restricted to articles of food, though I could mention a dozen more, the villainy of mixing gypsum or chalk with flour among them. Fraud is practiced in the sale of articles of every sort, flannel, stockings, etc. Are stretched, and shrink after the first washing. Narrow cloth is sold as being from 1½ to 3 inches broader than it actually is. Stoneware is so thinly glazed that the glazing is good for nothing and cracks at once, and 100 other rascalities, tout comme chez nous. But the lion's share of the evil results of these frauds falls to the workers. The rich are less deceived, because they can pay the high prices of the large shops which have a reputation to lose, and would injure themselves more than their customers if they kept poor or adulterated wares. The rich are spoiled, too, by habitual good eating, and detect adulteration more easily with their sensitive palates. But the poor, the working people, to whom a couple of farthings are important, who must buy many things with little money, who cannot afford to inquire too closely into the quality of their purchases, and cannot do so in any case because they have had no opportunity of cultivating their taste, to their share fall all the adulterated, poisoned provisions. They must deal with the small retailers, must buy perhaps on credit, and these small retail dealers who cannot sell even the same quality of goods so cheaply as the largest retailers, because of their small capital and the large proportional expenses of their business, must knowingly or unknowingly buy adulterated goods in order to sell at the lower prices required, and to meet the competition of the others. Further, a large retail dealer who has extensive capital invested in his business is ruined with his ruined credit if detected in a fraudulent practice. But what harm does it do a small grocer, who has customers in a single street only, if frauds are proved against him? If no one trusts him in Ancoats, he moves to Chawton or Hume, where no one knows him, and where he continues to defraud as before. While legal penalties attach to very few adulterations unless they involve revenue frauds. Not in the quality alone, but in the quantity of his goods as well, is the English working man defrauded. The small dealers usually have false weights and measures, and an incredible number of convictions for such offences may be read in the police reports. How universal this form of fraud is in the manufacturing districts, a couple of extracts from the Manchester Guardian may serve to show. They cover only a short period, and, even here, I have not all the numbers at hand. Guardian, June 15, 1844, Rochdale Sessions. 4 dealers fined 5 to 10 shillings for using light weights. Stockport Sessions. 2 dealers fined 1 shilling, one of them having 7 light weights and a false scale, and both having been warned. Guardian, June 19, Rochdale Sessions. 1 dealer fined 5, and 2 farmers 10 shillings. Guardian, June 22, Manchester Justices of the Peace. 19 dealers fined 2 shillings and sixpence to £2. Guardian, June 26, Ashton Sessions. 14 dealers and farmers fined 2 shillings and sixpence to £1. Hyde Petty Sessions. 9 farmers and dealers condemned to pay costs and 5 shillings fines. Guardian, July 6, Manchester. 16 dealers condemned to pay costs and fines not exceeding 10 shillings. Guardian, July 13, Manchester. 9 dealers fined from 2 shillings and sixpence to 20 shillings. Guardian, July 24, Rochdale. 4 dealers fined 10 to 20 shillings. Guardian, July 27, Bolton. 12 dealers and innkeepers condemned to pay costs. Guardian, August 3, Bolton. 3 dealers fined 2 shillings and sixpence, and 5 shillings. Guardian, August 10, Bolton. 1 dealer fined 5 shillings. And the same causes which make the working class the chief sufferers from frauds in the quality of goods make them the usual victims of frauds in the question of quantity too. The habitual food of the individual working man naturally varies according to his wages. The better paid workers, especially those in whose families every member is able to earn something, have good food as long as this state of things lasts. Meat daily and bacon and cheese for supper. Where wages are less, meat is used only 2 or 3 times a week, and the proportion of bread and potatoes increases. Descending gradually, we find the animal food reduced to a small piece of bacon cut up with the potatoes. Lower still, even this disappears, and there remain only bread, cheese, porridge, and potatoes, until on the lowest round of the ladder, among the Irish, potatoes form the sole food. As an accompaniment, weak tea, with perhaps a little sugar, milk, or spirits, is universally drunk. Tea is regarded in England, and even in Ireland, as quite as indispensable as coffee in Germany, and where no tea is used, the bitterest poverty reigns. But all this presupposes that the workman has work. When he has none, he is wholly at the mercy of accident, and eats what is given him, what he can beg or steal. And, if he gets nothing, he simply starves, as we have seen. The quantity of food varies, of course, like its quality, according to the rate of wages, so that among ill-paid workers, even if they have no large families, hunger prevails in spite of full and regular work. And the number of the ill-paid is very large. Especially in London, where the competition of the workers rises with the increase of population. This class is very numerous, but it is to be found in other towns as well. In these cases all sorts of devices are used. Potato parings, vegetable refuse, and rotten vegetables 15 are eaten for want of other food, and everything greedily gathered up which may possibly contain an atom of nourishment. And, if the week's wages are used up before the end of the week, it often enough happens that in the closing days the family gets only as much food, if any, as is barely sufficient to keep off starvation. Of course, such a way of living unavoidably engenders a multitude of diseases, and when these appear, when the father from whose work the family is chiefly supported, whose physical exertion most demands nourishment, and who therefore first succumbs, when the father is utterly disabled, then misery reaches its height, and then the brutality with which society abandons its members, just when their need is greatest, comes out fully into the light of day. To sum up briefly the facts thus far cited. The great towns are chiefly inhabited by working people, since in the best case there is one bourgeois for 2 workers, often for 3, here and there for 4. These workers have no property whatsoever of their own, and live wholly upon wages, which usually go from hand to mouth. Society, composed wholly of atoms, does not trouble itself about them. Leaves them to care for themselves and their families, yet supplies them no means of doing this in an efficient and permanent manner. Every working man, even the best, is therefore constantly exposed to loss of work and food, that is to death by starvation, and many perish in this way. The dwellings of the workers are everywhere badly planned, badly built, and kept in the worst condition, badly ventilated, damp, and unwholesome. The inhabitants are confined to the smallest possible space, and at least one family usually sleeps in each room. The interior arrangement of the dwellings is poverty-stricken in various degrees, down to the utter absence of even the most necessary furniture. The clothing of the workers, too, is generally scanty, and that of great multitudes is in rags. The food is, in general, bad, often almost unfit for use, and in many cases, at least at times, insufficient in quantity, so that, in extreme cases, death by starvation results. Thus the working class of the great cities offers a graduated scale of conditions in life, in the best cases a temporarily endurable existence for hard work and good wages, good and endurable, that is, from the worker's standpoint. In the worst cases, bitter want, reaching even homelessness and death by starvation. The average is much nearer the worst case than the best. And this series does not fall into fixed classes, so that one can say, this fraction of the working class is well off, has always been so, and remains so. If that is the case here and there, if single branches of work have in general an advantage over others, yet the condition of the workers in each branch is subject to such great fluctuations that a single working man may be so placed as to pass through the whole range from comparative comfort to the extremest need, even to death by starvation, while almost every English working man can tell a tale of marked changes of fortune. Let us examine the causes of this somewhat more closely. Notes. 3. This applies to the time of sailing vessels. The Thames now is a dreary collection of ugly steamers. F. E. Note by Engels to the American edition of 1887. 1892. This was written nearly 50 years ago, in the days of the picturesque sailing vessels. In so far as such ships still ply to and from London, they are now to be found only in the docks, while the river itself is covered with ugly, sooty steamers. Note by Engels to the German edition of 1892. Return to text. 4. The description given below had already been written when I came across an article in the Illuminated magazine, October 1844, dealing with the working class districts in London, which coincides, in many places almost literally and everywhere in general tenor, with what I had said. The article was entitled, The Dwellings of the Poor, from the Notebook of an MD, note by Engels. Return to text. 5. Times, October 12, 1843. Note by Engels. Return to text. 6. Quoted by Dr. W. P. Allison, FRSE, Fellow and late President of the Royal College of Physicians, etc., etc. Observations on the Management of the Poor in Scotland and its Effects on the Health of Great Towns, Edinburgh. 1840. The author is a religious Tory, brother of the historian, Archibald Allison. Note by Engels. Return to text. 7. Report to the Home Secretary from the Poor Law Commissioner, on an inquiry into the sanitary condition of the labouring classes in Great Britain, with appendix. Presented to both Houses of Parliament in July, 1842, 3 vols, folio. Assembled and arranged from medical reports by Edwin Chadwick, Secretary of the Poor Law Commissioners. Note by Engels. Return to text. 8. Arts and Artisans at Home and Abroad, by J. C. Simons, Edinburgh, 1839. The author, as it seems, himself a Scotchman, is a liberal, and consequently fanatically opposed to every independent movement of working men. The passages here cited are to be found page 116 et seq. Note by Engels. Return to text. 9. It must be borne in mind that these cellars are not mere storing rooms for rubbish, but dwellings of human beings. Note by Engels. Return to text. 10. The moral and physical condition of the working classes employed in the cotton manufacture in Manchester. By James P.H. K. M.D. 2nd ed. 1852. Dr. K confuses the working class in general with the factory workers, otherwise an excellent pamphlet. Note by Engels. Return to text. 11. And yet an English liberal wiseacre asserts, in the report of the Children's Employment Commission, that these courts are the masterpiece of municipal architecture, because, like a multitude of little parks, they improve ventilation, the circulation of air. Certainly, if each court had 2 or 4 broad open entrances facing each other, through which the air could pour, but they never have 2, rarely 1, and usually only a narrow covered passage. Note by Engels. Return to text. 12. Nassau W. Senior, Letters on the Factory Act to the R.T. Hon. The President of the Board of Trade Chas. Paulette Thompson, ESQ. London, 1837, p. 24. Note by Engels. Return to text. 13. P. Gaskell, The Manufacturing Population of England, its moral, social and physical condition, and the changes which have arisen from the use of steam machinery. With an examination of infant labour. Fiat Justicia, 1855. Depicting chiefly the state of the working class in Lancashire. The author is a liberal, but wrote at a time when it was not a feature of liberalism to chant the happiness of the workers. He is therefore unprejudiced, and can afford to have eyes for the evils of the present state of things, and especially for the factory system. On the other hand, he wrote before the Factories Inquiry Commission, and adopts from untrustworthy sources many assertions afterwards refuted by the report of the Commission. This work, although on the whole a valuable one, can therefore only be used with discretion, especially as the author, like K, confuses the whole working class with the mill hands. The history of the development of the proletariat contained in the introduction to the present work, is chiefly taken from this work of Gaskell's. Note by Engels. Return to text. 14. Thomas Carlyle, Chartism, London, 1840, p.28. Concerning Thomas Carlyle see below. Note by Engels. Return to text. 15. Weekly Dispatch, April or May, 1844, according to a report by Drive. Southwood Smith on the condition of the poor in London. Note by Engels. Return to text. Next chapter. Table of contents marks Engels' archive.